And I might just say, just that I found this entry, arrived in Boston at 4:45, cold, rainy day, hung around the station a while, hoping to get some coffee, but the restaurant was closed, took a cab to the hotel, which was the Hotel Hemingway, slept for a few hours, up at 8:30, went straight to Symphony Hall, only to be told by Bourgain that Koussevitzky was ill with a cold and that he would take over the rehearsals. Now Bourgain had done the reading when Kuss wanted to hear, he had several readings before the season that he planned to do it. And he had, I think I told you, there was Quincy Porter there, and there was also Douglas Moore, who had a work being read at that time. And it was very embarrassing for me, being much younger than them, to have had such a fabulous reading. They began reading and they didn't stop, and it's a long symphony. And the moment he heard it, it's Zyviel play. And then he heard their pieces read, and he said not a word to them. And of course, he never played it. They were terrible pieces, I'll have to admit. But it was awful, when these sort of things happen.
Now, that's the rehearsal. I imagine that we got that, I told you on the telephone, it's about 35 minutes of it on a recording in the Library of Congress. And
Kussy had rehearsed it. He had rehearsed it before I got there. It was just he became ill. I think it was a day or 2 days before. Let's see, he was ill with a cold, and that he would take over the rehearsals. Koussevitzky had made a few cuts of his own in order to fit it into the radio hour. This angered me terribly. I called him and told him this, and Kuss said to rehearse all morning without cuts. I was immediately impressed. The splendid workout, and at the end, the men gave me a fine ovation. I was thrilled and grateful. A taxi out to Brookline, where Kussy received me warmly. He remained in bed, and he mutually agreed upon cuts and said he would reinstate them for New York, but this had to be done in order to get it all into the radio hour. Lunch there with Miss Naumov and a Russian woman named Mrs. Hirschman. Then back to Kussy's, who reviewed the cuts and decided finally that he would do them without cuts and would hurry the foot, which I think opened the program. He gave me a suit of his and ties to wear to Friday's concert. He was not satisfied with the suit I was wearing, but the trousers do not fit, and they are spotted. He said to take them over to the tailor. I'm impressed by his generosity, but rather angry that he didn't think I looked well enough. He said he would pay all my expenses.
He was reputed to be quite an elegant dresser.
Well, he opened the closet door and he said, "Peek." So all these suits lined up. Naturally, my eye went for the best brown one. I still have it, as a matter of fact. Bernstein wanted to get it away from me, but I said nothing to him. You give me Metropolis's crucifix, which really he had promised me on his death. Instead, Bernstein came. I said, "You give me the crucifix, you can have Kuss's suit." But every page has a description which I reread, what went on and everything that went on, who was at the concert, all the composers there. So it pretty much corroborated my memory.
Well, I'll see what we can do at the end of the week. I'll ask them in the Library of Congress about what permissions we'd have to get a copy of that rehearsal. I mean, I don't know if your writing for the Library of Congress would be enough, or whether...
Oh, yes, I've done it before. There was a man who died who was head there. I don't know the new people, but it was Don Levitt. But whoever is filling in for Don Levitt would certainly do, because I've received other things from them.
Oh, that would be super then.
Oh.
Okay.
God knows they have enough of my stuff there. I don't see why they wouldn't want to.
Well, it's just with the copyright situation, they're really...
Oh, well, they don't. No, they're very cooperative.
Oh, that's terrific, because I'd certainly like to have a copy of that rehearsal myself. It's about 35 minutes long, which for that type of recording is quite...
Of the rounds or the symphony?
The Second Symphony.
Gee, I would love... And that is Koussevitzky speaking in broken English?
Definitely.
Oh, well, then it was before he became ill. Because, you see, he was in bed for the day before the concert. So he had rehearsed it pretty well. He knew it. Going over it with me in bed, he knew it very well.
Well, I think it might be interesting to have on the tape any memories that you have of how perhaps you first met Dr. Koussevitzky.
Oh, sure. But you will ask questions, won't you?
Well, yes. I mean, perhaps I should just say that over again, to make it more concise.
Because unless you keep me geared to, angle me into the subject, I might go off into all tangents.
That's the best way to do these things.
All
I
right.
found.
Then you edit.
Oh yes.
All right.
Yes. Perhaps
Although I would like you to send me an agreement that this can only be used for your own personal use, or whatever it's going to be used as part of the legacy, and that copies of it cannot be made for any other purpose except
right. Oh, certainly.
Yeah, because my lawyer insists on all that.
Oh, surely. There'll be no problem about that. Okay, well, perhaps if you could share with us your memories of how you first met Dr. Koussevitzky, how you came to his attention.
Is it going?
Sure.
Oh. I met Koussevitzky through Aaron Copland. It was very early in I would say around 1934 or 35. I was studying at the Dalcroze Institute, a new music school with Roger Sessions, and I had met Copland the spring of 35. And the first thing he said to me is, "I think you ought to meet this astonishing man." He quizzed me a little bit and wanted to know whether I'd really known how much Koussevitzky had done for contemporary music. He didn't mention American music because he hadn't really at that time done much. He had done a few of the Boston composers in the 20s when he was there, like Foote and Edward Burlingame Hill and Walter Piston, early pieces of Walter Piston. But the Koussevitzky that everybody realized had done so much more than any other conductor, as a matter of fact, in America, was a very remarkable man, because he sought out the American composers, actually. And Copland asked me whether I'd realized that he had also given many premieres of works of the great French composers and the Russian composers. In other words, Copland was quizzing me to see whether this kid from Rochester was as smart as he had been told that I was. And of course I was a walking encyclopedia, because I spent most of my high school years in the Sibley Music Library here at the Easton School. And then of course when I became a student at the Easton School, I was always in the library. I was bored stiff with the classes there, and that's one reason I left the Easton School after 1 year. I'd had it, because Hansen and I just didn't see eye to eye, and he was always saying things like, "Now, David, you're such a talented young man. Why do you have to write such modernist music?" Well, what he considered modernist, is not to be believed. I mean, highly chromatic music would be modernist. But I can assure you that what I was writing then was not half as, quote, modern as his Lament for Beowulf, a piece that really today is even quite startling for its quartal harmony, you see. But he was a peculiar man. He didn't have a wide tolerance. He's another one who was played by Koussevitzky and really was put on the map by Koussevitzky. Koussevitzky had played his early symphonies, and then he had played the Romantic Symphony and then the other symphonies of his. So that it was strange going to school here. And as a matter of fact, this Second Symphony, the week before I was to go to Boston to begin the rehearsals of it, Hansen read through the Second Symphony here. And he was so impressed with it that he said, "Oh, you're going to have a very big success." He said, "David, how very, very much your music has changed in less than 10 years since you were a student here." I said, "On the contrary, Dr. Hansen, it's the very, very same kind of music. I don't know what you were hearing at that time."
So then Hansen liked the Second Symphony.
Yes, very much so. He predicted a big success for it, you see. So I was very pleased that he had read through it, because we weren't talking for many years. After I quit the school, he was naturally offended in his way of being offended. And as a matter of fact, stayed offended, never recorded anything of mine, but recorded all of his music, which is another reason why I detested the man. The ego was tremendous, you see. He used up all the money for the American Composers Concerts, recording his own works. He was supposed to have published works. He published his own symphonies up to, I think, number 3. Nobody else got published after his Third Symphony. So that all that money really was not utilized for American music. He got about 10% in of other composers. He never got around to recording a Copland piece until the 40s. Nothing of Sessions until the 40s, nothing of mine, but all his little ex-students, at the Eastman School, and then, of course, every one of his own pieces. So we didn't remain on very, very good terms. But I must say that every time we bumped somewhere and we had to serve on committees in the following years, we always talked of how wonderful Koussevitzky was to the American composer. And, of course, I would let him have it right in the belly by saying, of course, and that's what you wanted to do too, but you never really, really accomplished it, did you, Howard? And he turned red in his usual way and pulled out his little beard. But to come back to Copland, he was really the man who really got Koussevitzky interested in the American composer, whereas Hansen really did not very much. He was too involved in his own music to try to encourage any other composers. But Copland did take me back after one of the Boston Symphony concerts. And I remember Blanche and Alfred Knopf were there, and it was a very distinguished green room group there. And I remember he looked right through me, and Madame Koussevitzky was there, very tall, with her huge beak of a nose. For some reason, she made me think of Lillian Hellman, sort of an older Lillian Hellman at that time. I had met Lillian Hellman that year. Her play, The Children's Hour, was having a big success on Broadway, and I'd met her. I also had met Hellman here when she was working as a cashier at the Temple Theater, where there was a stock company for the Kukar-Kondolf players. So it's a very interesting way all these people connected, because she often would come to the Boston Symphony concerts too afterwards. Because people often ask, where did you get to meet so many famous people? I said, well, first of all, they were in Rochester when I was a child. You see, the city as it is today is nothing culturally, you see. Now, people say, well, but it is. I said, well, for you it's culture. I mean, you don't. I mean, the open air shows. I mean, this terrible painting that they have in the streets and the clothesline shows, all that. If that's what you call culture, and I've gotten to see some of the painters who are painting here, and it's just old hat abstract painting, or it's experimental stuff that was finished with 25 or 30, 35 years ago, and these kids are just discovering it all. Hanging contraceptives on things with melted wax and all sorts of things like that. That's not. But culture in my time was the Eastman Theater with Ruben Mamoulian directing the stage productions, and Martha Graham with two young dancers that she had here. Of course, she didn't get along with Hansen. Quit also, threw a phone book, Rochester phone book, 1924 phone book, or 26 phone book, threw it right at him. And out she went, never would even think of him. She's that horrible man, I won't have anything to do with it. And she didn't think much of George Eastman either. But no, what was wonderful that they brought in the Russians, you see. We had an orchestra that was one of the great, it was among the 5 topped. Now it's absolutely pathetic, this orchestra. It's a kind of a high school orchestra, high school university orchestra. There are some universities out west that play rings around the Rochester Philharmonic. Zinman managed to pull them together. But when I was a kid, we had Coates and Eugene Goossens as the conductor, and of course the personnel of the orchestra were all Russians. Eventually, some of them went to Koussevitzky's orchestra. As a matter of fact, when I went for performances of the symphony, I looked, and there in the back stands were Vladimir Reznikov, who was here in 1925 with the orchestra, others, Russians and French people who had played here and then went on to play with the Boston Symphony when the theater was sold to what they called Paramount Publics Unit, and that was the beginning of the decline of Rochester's culture, because why they had to do that, I don't know, any more than they had to tear down the beautiful theaters. No other city tore them down. St. Louis rebuilt its great theater for concerts. We tore down the Loews Rochester, the Loews Palace. These were fabulous theaters, that great deluxe tradition, like the Radio City Music Hall. And this was all going on before the Radio City Music Hall. We had stage shows, we had orchestral accompaniment with films, I remember seeing Lon Chaney and the Phantom of the Opera with the whole Faust score being played with they called it the Rochester Symphony, conducted by Victor Wagner. But that's, you see, Rochester had a real professional culture then. The art gallery wasn't much then, but people like the Watsons, Dr. Sibley Watson and Alec Wilder lived here then, and they were shooting amateur movies and made The Fall of the House of Usher, and Lot and Sodom were made here down Canandaigua Lake by Dr. Watson. But there was much going on, you see. Today it's an altogether, thank you, it's an altogether different thing.
When Dr. Koussevitzky was preparing your works, did you find that he was changing a lot of things and playing things in a way that would be a great deal different from the way you had intended it or expected it?
No, not to that degree. I've heard stories from other composers that he had a tendency to do that. But I wrote the kind of music that wouldn't give too much leeway for any kind of stretching of tempos. You see, he after all, his generation of conducted a lot of Tchaikovsky. He wasn't very good at Stravinsky particularly, because you have to be very precise, and Stravinsky wanted everything metronomically correct, and Koussevitzky liked to stretch things out, which is why Bernstein does pretty much the same thing today. It's taken directly from Koussevitzky, and Bernstein, the older he gets, just as Koussevitzky, the older he got, slower and slower, especially slow movements, you know. So that the only thing I was amazed about in this performance, even at the end of his life, the last years he was conducting, he had not begun to get slower and slower at all. But he did put in what you call rubati, that is stealing a little time from here. He'd stretch things out, you know, for expressive reasons, which sort of 19th century or late romantic kind of way of conducting. It comes from that tradition of Nickish, after all. But my music didn't lend itself to that, especially the rounds. You had to absolutely beat tick-tock, and everything went, you see. And he rather liked that, because he said to me, he said, you know, it gives me lots of pleasure. He had a wonderful way of mixing French with English, fractured French, some Russian. When I told him my parents had come from Poland and they spoke Ukrainian, of course he would allow himself to use Russian and Ukrainian words too, some German. But he was absolutely extraordinary at the rehearsals, because when he'd be enthusiastic about something, he would. That's why I'm very anxious to hear what goes on at that rehearsal. He would stop and he would say, "I will tell you something. I will tell you that this is most beautiful music, and you must play so." Then he'd sort of sing, make a ghastly sound, you know, and of course they wouldn't understand what in God's name he means by this terrible sound that came out of him. Well, Toscanini was like that too. They would growl things, and the orchestra would get hysterical with laughter because it sounded so terrible. But he got his ideas. You know, there are mythological tales about Koussevitzky being really, in the long run, not a very good musician. That's nonsense. He was a very good musician. That was all built up by jealous orchestra musicians, because he was rather rude to many of them. But that was the tradition, again, of late 19th century, that the conductor kept his men in the orchestra very much under the whip, you know, tight reins. No friendly give and take between them at all.
When you wrote the Second Symphony, did you have any idea that it was going to be played by the Boston Symphony?
Oh, well, yes. I didn't tell you. After Copeland had introduced me that early on, I would submit to him almost annually works. And each time he would read through them. I found out from Borgen, because Tanglewood had begun, you see, so I'd go up to Tanglewood, and I'd hear rumors, or he'd see me, and he would come up to me and he'd say, "Trop cerebral, too cerebral," that last piece, "trop cerebral." And I would say, well, I don't understand why it was a piece today that, nobody considers it elegy in memory of Ravel. Ravel had died in December of 37, and I wrote this elegy, and Copland thought that Koussevitzky would be interested in it because he wanted to do something, since he had commissioned Ravel to make the arrangement of pictures at an exhibition of Mussorgsky, and so it would be good to begin the program perhaps with my elegy. But no, he had it read, so it was trop cerebral. Years later, of course, he didn't think it was trop cerebral. But I would send pieces, but it was not until he heard a lousy performance that Hansen did at Columbia University for the Ditson Fund of my rounds, and typically what happened was typical Hansen nonsense. He rehearsed his own symphony for most of the time and left 20 minutes for my rounds, and of course it was a butchered. I mean, they could barely get through the notes because he hadn't rehearsed it, you see. Well, Koussevitzky caught on to this, and he let Hansen have it. I just told him I was that kind of a young man. I said, ask him. He's doing the same thing in New York that he does in Rochester. He rehearses all his own music all the time, and we are given that much. And he says, Howard, you did this? And Howard turned red. He was always getting red, but would never say anything more than. But that's what happened. And then he turned to me and says, I will show how we play this piece. You see. And by God, he did. Wonderful performances of the rounds. Then Howard didn't talk to me for 2 more years. But then, after the rounds, he said that he wanted to commission work, and that's when I wrote the 4th Symphony. But once he had known the 2nd Symphony, then he played everything, that was... only if it was first performance, you see. Because other works I had given to Ormandy or to Stokowski or something, then he didn't play them. He wanted only first performances. See, that's one reason Piston being up there, all the composers who lived in Boston, it was fine. Piston would write every new symphony and it would be first performance by Koussevitzky. But we got on very, very well, and I must say the success he had with the 2nd Symphony made him very happy, and that's why he wrote that wonderful article, I think it was for the Boston Globe, saying that it was perhaps for that time. I mean, I'm thinking of this is before the Copland Symphony, before any of those pieces, before William Schumann's bigger symphonies. He said, this is the most typical. He said, here is something very national, meaning it's very American, you see. And I'm not so sure I know, but because when Schoenberg heard the broadcast, which he did on Saturday night, and I saw Schoenberg in Hollywood, he said to me, how come you don't ask me whether you should write in the 12-note technique? And I said, well, I don't think that I have any talent for that kind. He says, I never really had talent to that. My best music is Wagnerian music, too, you see. He says, anyway, you're a young Bruckner. I heard your 2nd Symphony. That's young Bruckner music,
It's quite a compliment,
and
isn't it?
that's really the influence, is Bruckner, except for the last movement, which is sort of a very hoedown kind of music before Copland began even doing it. See, lots of people forget that we had all done that before Copland had invented that style. You see, one hears my first violin piano sonata, which Copland loved, then they say right away, or you hear my pieces from the 30s. See, Copland didn't begin writing these things until the late 30s. And the 40s is when he does Appalachian String. So that the books yet are to be written, which get down to prove. And this is why I'm very sad about the situation, because already Copland is beginning to recede. You see, there are fewer performances of music. And that's why it's, in a way, it's good that his memory is shot, because he is suffering from Alzheimer's, and that he doesn't remember things, because it would have pained him to find out that his music is not being performed as much. He has lots of music, better music than the Americana music, which is not performed at all, like the Symphonic Ode, which Koussevitzky commissioned. But I think that there was a whole school of my generation who were writing a real American-sounding music before Copland and before Roy Harris, you see. But we did not make it as fast as they did, you see. They were the first top ones. And so Roy Harris's Third Symphony was what was heard, not my Second Symphony. That comes later. That comes in the 40s.
Well, you see, the reason I asked you if you wrote the Second Symphony with the Boston Symphony in mind was because of a remark that a friend of mine made to me last winter. I had just made the new takeoff from the old transcription records, the takeoff that ended up in that cassette that I sent you.
Mm-hmm.
And I was particularly struck by the beautiful string passages in the Second Symphony, of course, with the Boston Symphony and Koussevitzky playing that very heavy vibrato.
How about the sound, even on that recording, how about the sound of that orchestra in relation to the sound today? It's scandalous what has happened to that orchestra. I mean, Mr. Ozawa should be decapitated.
Well,
I mean, Leinsdorf managed to hold some quality of sound there, you see. But with Ozawa, the players are totally different, of course. I mean, maybe one or three of the older percussion players, a couple of the brass players still. But I don't find any of the old players. They'd be too old to be in it. So an orchestra is going to change in that sense, too. But Ozawa's his whole sense of sound is so very different from what Koussevitzky got out of that orchestra. Remember, they were Russians and they were French. That wind section, I mean, they talk about the winds with the Boston Symphony. Very beautiful, but listen to Daphnis and Chloe of Ravel with Koussevitzky conducting, or even Munch, and listen to that flute solo compared to this lady that they have, I mean, it's one shouldn't compare, of course. She's very good, and the orchestra's good, but it never can compare to the greatness that the Boston Symphony was, you see. This is what's sad about what happens to orchestras.
Well, you see, I had cleaned up those records with some new chemicals and stuff that we got, and was able to start hearing those string passages an awful lot better than when I had worked with those records.
Well, as I say,
before.
get some of those old Victor recordings he made of the Ravel, and you'll hear that string sound was better than the Philadelphia Orchestra sound. And Stokowski had really he had more or less the top reputation for string sound, which, by the way, the Philadelphia still has. You see, with all the composers that have conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra since Stokowski died, or since Stokowski left the orchestra, even through Armidy's time, never did the sound of the Philadelphia Orchestra change. The Boston Symphony changed terribly.
But those string passages are so beautiful, and
well, that's why Koussevitzky liked the piece, because in my orchestration, I gave many large sections, especially in the slow music, to the strings.
Yeah, well, see, I happened to mention this to my friend Larry Goodwin. I was talking to him on the telephone. Of course, I'm in Florida, and he still lives up in Boston, but I was mentioning to him, I said, I got this new transfer of the Diamond Second Symphony. He said, oh, these string passages are so beautiful.
They are. I was very impressed with them.
Tear your heart out, they're so beautiful. And then Larry came right back to me, and he said, I'll bet. He said that Diamond knew that Koussevitzky was going to play that, and he wrote that just for Koussevitzky.
No. Actually, I wrote it with the hope that Metropolis would play it, because Metropolis had given the premiere of my first symphony with the New York Philharmonic. And he was so pleased with that. He said, now, and that was a very tight economical work. He said, now, your next symphony must be big. I want a big, wonderful symphony. And so I thought I would. And, of course, the war was on, and I was very depressed because I couldn't go into it. Excuse me.
All right, we'll just...
Now, where was I?
Well, let's see. You were...
Oh, yes. So Metropolis did want the big symphony, and he had hoped to give it with the Minneapolis Orchestra. Then when I sent him the score, and I must say he was an extraordinarily generous man, he paid for the copying of the parts and the duplication of the score. And I had sent a copy of the score to Koussevitzky as well, because I had heard rumors that Metropolis might not be staying on in Minneapolis, that he was going to do much more guest conducting. And so I thought, well, I didn't want the symphony to just sit around for a couple of years waiting for a conductor to do it. So I sent one to Koussevitzky and one to Metropolis. And I told Metropolis that I had done that. He said, well, my dear, I think that it would be wonderful if Koussevitzky, not knowing that they were not on good terms, because, as you probably know, Metropolis had a phenomenal success when he was invited to be guest conductor there, and then was never asked back by Koussevitzky after that phenomenal success. It became something of a scandal because it was such an obvious thing. A man who showed himself to be rather a genius on the podium, very unique in every way, not to be asked back when it was such a great success. And it turned out, I think, to be quite true. I still think that that was the reason he didn't get asked back.
Because he was too successful.
Because he was too successful, yes. And so it shows again what a wonderful human being Metropolis was, because he said, I think it would be wonderful if Koussevitzky did it. After all, I did your first symphony with the New York Philharmonic. He should do the second symphony. And then later on he would commission the rounds, so I thought Metropolis was being an absolute saint, which he was. So what happened was that Koussevitzky had John Burke, the program annotator of the Boston Symphony, send me a telegram saying, reading your second symphony and the date, the hour, it was sometime in very, very early part of the spring of 44, and be at Symphony Hall at this hour. And as I told you, Howard Hansen had the parts and was reading through it. And of course, he sent the parts the moment he was through with his reading. He sent them right off to Boston. By the time I got to Boston, the reading began, and Douglas Moore was with me in that row that's facing the stage from my right, looking down, Quincy Porter, Douglas Moore, and Koussevitzky on my other side, and Borgin, the concertmaster, read through. They didn't stop once. They went right through it, you see. So he had the reading, and he was that sure that it was for him. He said, I will play. See, just like that. And sure enough, I had a telegram from Olga Naumov, who he later married. And she was his secretary, his personal secretary, stating that the work was scheduled for the 13th and 14th of October 1944, and that it would be on the broadcast with the foot strip. What's it called?
The Suite for Strings.
Suite for Strings, yeah. Right. And I can't remember what was on the other half. Was it a Sibelius symphony? I'm not sure. But at any rate, it had a fine, even with the Friday afternoon audience, it had a wonderful success, because those ladies were terrible, in general, because they just talked a lot. They weren't interested in applauding. There were also Boston ladies, like that. But, my God, the guys from Harvard, wow, all on the back part, those yells that were coming around. Robert Lowell, the poet, was among them, and Arthur Berger, and Irving Fine, and a few others who were young students.
Well, it's got wonderful melodies in it. As I sit here, I've got that theme from the first movement. Da, 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 da. I probably hum worse than Koussevitzky, but I get that running through my mind, and it's I've gotten to like this symphony very much.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wish those lazy young'uns would get to play. See, this is the problem. If Koussevitzky were alive today, he would say terrible things about, because here a man sets up Tanglewood. A whole school of American conductors grow out of Tanglewood through Bernstein's teaching, and he's doing less and less Americans too. He hasn't gotten around. He gave the premiere of my Ninth Symphony 3 years ago. Said the next year I'm doing it with the New York Philharmonic and with the Chicago Symphony, and lo and behold, what's he doing with the Chicago? He did it last week. Not mine, Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony. Why? That's typical Bernstein. He knows this is the moment to do it, because Gorbachev, perestroika. So this is what Bernstein, in getting into his 70th year, is going to do. He's not going to play my lugubrious Ninth Symphony, which was all about death and dying, based on Michelangelo's sonnets. You see, he knows. He'll get around to playing it with, I'm sure, the New York Philharmonic when he's good and ready and knows what program he wants it. But I'm sure he knows it's too lugubrious a work for what he wants to do. But for that matter, so is the Leningrad Symphony. You know, it's a very long. It's a whole evening's concert. But you see, he doesn't push American music. But the American conductors, the young American conductors, are scandalous. They go to Europe, and they don't bring the American composers' music, but they are forced to play composers in that country. That's part of the law of Europe, every country, that you have to play a work by that composer of that particular country. So you see how ass backwards it always has been, you see. Zinman doesn't do a damn American work in Holland. He hasn't, as far as I know, and there's James Conlon. They have orchestras in Europe. Now, Mark Elder, who's going to be our new conductor a year after next, finally wrote me a letter that he would like to meet with me, that he's rather upset to find that I have not appeared on a Rochester Philharmonic program. There have been several articles in the papers about the neglect of my music in Rochester. But that asshole Zinman, you know, what do you expect? An absolute jerk of the first water, talented jerk.
I'm not familiar with his work at all. I just have heard the name a couple
Well,
of times.
he did good things for what he had to deal with, but he showed no interest at all in my music, was extremely rude to my sister, who was a member of the ladies' committee with the orchestra. And I made an effort to go back to see him once, and his wife, who vulgar, dreadful woman, just pushed the door in my face, so I kicked it in, and it was, really got to be a nasty situation. Well, Elder heard about this, and I had conducted the Philharmonic for my 50th birthday. When Shomoji was the conductor here, he invited me to conduct my third symphony. So when Elder looked up and saw there was only, and then of course after that I really called Zinman some terrible names going down the stairs. The next year he put the rounds on. It was such a lousy performance that I wouldn't go to the performance. I'd listen to it on the air, you see. And of course I knew what the troubles was. He was already having trouble with the personnel and with the management and all that. So that was the situation. But Elder, obviously, when he comes in November to conduct, I guess, wants to talk about reparations, if one can do that. It scandalized him that at the age of 73, in my hometown, there is so little performance, even on the radio. You see, we're getting a British Empire. We have the British Empire here on WXXI. It's British music morning, noon, and night. And this is because we have Gladwell and we have his other friend, I forget what his name again,
Simon Ponton.
Simon Ponton, you see. And they have my tapes there. And then there is a man named Bunin or something. He said to me, Mr. Dom, yes, we have your music. We have your records, but we have to play the latest because of the acousticals. They're so much better than many of the tapes. I said, look, don't give me that, because you're playing old recordings all the time. I hear them morning, noon, and night. These are not new compact discs that are being played during the day. One or two are, but you're playing a lot of old music too. But this is the way it goes on. You see, it's the old story. Psychologically, nobody can tell you why they treat a person that way. You see. Now, people say it could be your personality because you talk very, very directly. You don't mince words. I said I never talk that way until they bring me to that point. You see, when they begin saying, "Oh, but your records, we have to use the records with the best acoustical thing," that's when I flip my lid, because that is a lot of crap. If they're going to play old 78s and they're going to do this and old ones, then you can afford to do some of mine. No, it's the psychology is, the old one, profit without honor in your own. It's still true. All composers were treated that way, except in Boston.
Could you tell us again, because when you told it when we first came in here this afternoon, we didn't have the tape recorder going, the story about the Hit Parade Orchestra and Frank Sinatra and Koussevitzky and the Life magazine article and so forth. I thought that was a good story.
Well, I was broke in New York in those early years, and I had been trained as a violinist, and I was a member of the local 802 in New York, and Mark Warno, who had heard a great deal about me and had heard my music, thought it was terrible that I could get a teaching job anywhere. And those were the years, where it was very, very hard. I mean, universities were not. The Columbia University was run by a very conservative anti-Semite named Daniel Gregory Mason, and there was no chance. Even Douglas Moore, teaching there, knew me and liked my music, couldn't get me in there. And it was that way everywhere, and even here, of course. Hansen would never think of giving me a job because I was always, upsetting people if I'd come to visit. This house belonged to my family, so I would come sometimes, stay here for a week, go to a concert, or go to a rehearsal of his, and I'd say something, would get back to somebody, and then there's David Diamond shooting his mouth off again, So the possibility of teaching with Howard Hansen at school was out of the question because you had to buckle under. You see, people like Bernard Rogers taught here, who was meek as a mouse. He never said anything.
Hansen had a pretty big ego then, huh?
Oh my God, he was monster ego. Perfectly pleasant man, but a dull man, actually. He wrote an autobiography which he submitted to Scribner's. It's of such dullness that they said, God, did nothing exciting happen in that man's life? It means nothing but his performances and me. So they didn't accept the book for publication. I remember when he heard about it, he asked me, he said, what do you think the problem was? They're bringing out Otto Looning's autobiography. I said, well, Howard, nothing exciting ever did happen to you. Even scandalous things that I heard about, are they true? And I used to hear about you going off to Buffalo on week. Now, enough of that, I said, well, those are the things you have to get into your book. What about your sex life? Now, David, we won't go on. He had this terrible. You couldn't. Then, of course, this alcoholic wife of his. She's still around here. It's a horror. But there was no possible way, of getting anywhere a teaching job in those years. So I said, look, I'll do an audition if you like, Mr. Warren. He said, no. A lot of the men in the orchestra were former members of the New York Philharmonic. You'll enjoy it, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the music. So I went, and all I could remember, the first rehearsal, I said, is nothing going to be in 5/8 time? Is everything going to be in 2/2? Everything was cha-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. You had to be in 2. Everything was beat in 2, or now and then there was a waltz. When Oklahoma came out, we did those waltzes. I remember it. Everything was in 2. So I would say to Warno, let's sneak a 5/8 in here in this arrangement. He thought it was funny. He said, we'll do it just for you. But of course, George Washington Hill, the head of the Lucky Strike Tobacco Company, censors everything. He has to hear. We have to send off the acetates immediately once we finish. And if there's something in the orchestration, if there's a chord that has a major ninth in it, out it goes. Everything has to be very, very simple and very clean.
And Lucky Strike sponsored the hit parade.
The hit parade. It's called your Lucky Strike hit parade. And there was a very typical announcer. Well, he had soloists every week, and at that time Frank Sinatra was starting, and I can still see him with his curls,
And about what year is this?
We're talking now around 1943, 44, something around there, 45, about there. And he was appearing at the Paramount, or there was Mildred Bailey, who was an absolutely fabulous singer, extraordinary singer, and B. Wayne, and Jerry Wayne, and, Evelyn Knight. These were wonderful singers at that time, and of course they were used in between regular orchestral performance numbers. But as I say, the one earned $95 net for 2 days of work, 1 day of rehearsal, and then the next day final rehearsal, and then 2 performances, one to the West Coast and one for the live New York audience, and that was that. So 95 a week in those years, 1943, 44. Through 45, that was quite enough, so I could get my music written and not waste a lot of time with teaching. You see, in many ways it was a better thing to do. Copeland thought it was a great idea, and so did others. But I have to thank a man named Nikolai Berezovsky, who had played in the CBS Symphony, and I had written some cues. Bernard Herrmann got me to do music from The Man Behind the Gun, and Hear It Now, the Ed Murrow show. And so Berezovsky, with whom I had studied violin when I first came to New York in 1934, went to Warner. I was then living at Yaddo. I was broke, and there was no place to go, and I didn't want to come here because my mother and father lived here, my sister and her husband and child, and I felt that's pushing myself on them. So I went to the artist colony called Yaddo in Saratoga Springs, and there Mrs. Ames put me up for almost an entire winter and part of the spring. And then Berezovsky sent me a letter with a violin because my violin had been stolen, and so I had no instrument. And he included this violin with a piggy bank, spending money, which all the men in the CBS Symphony contributed, because lots of them had played my music and they thought it was awful, that I should be reduced to this situation. And why I didn't play in the CBS Symphony is because those men were on contract annually. I mean, they went on year after year with Bernard Herrmann, so the Imitation of Music program that he conducted could not get me in. But Benny Herrmann did get me other things, of course, like writing cues. So between the writing cues and the playing in the hit parade, which I enjoyed very much, I was able to make a fairly good living and give my time to music.
I just want to turn the tape over here before...
Sure.
Where your thought was...
Sure.
Yeah, this way we don't miss anything.
And so when Koussevitzky heard about this, he evidently had been planning or had suggested to Life magazine that he make some statement about the American composer, because he felt that by now, the mid-40s, that there was definitely a school of American composition, that one could identify a real American style. And so he wrote this article for Life, which was edited very carefully by their editors, but all his thoughts and his statements. And I was singled out by him as one of the most gifted of the youngest of the Americans. But what a shame that I had to make my living by playing in the Hit Parade Orchestra. And I thought it was rather funny because I enjoyed it thoroughly. I liked the men in the orchestra. I enjoyed Mark Warno. I loved being with those marvelous singers. One learned more from, of course, you really couldn't hear them because they were singing into the mic. You see, nothing like today wearing the earphones. They didn't even wear those. They were tested up wherever it was up at Carnegie Hall, and their balances were worked out. But so all of it, were lips moving. But then when I'd go back and listen to the playbacks, and I heard Sinatra, I couldn't believe the phrasing of this man. I thought I was listening to Jascha Heifetz on The Voice, because it was so beautiful the way he phrased. And his voice was very, very good baritone. So it was planned, and during, the breaks and intermission, they were always up in the, just before you get to the green room, playing poker, and it was fun sort of hanging around watching them play poker and chewing the rag, as it was called, or running out for Cokes or going off somewhere to get Carnegie Hall delicatessen sandwich. Then back we'd go. And today, one thinks of that period as I do, and I realize that I enjoyed it very much. But I'm sorry that Koussevitzky felt it was demeaning. His was a 19th century romantic attitude that the composer was up there in Valhalla, with the muses, and so that's not what you were supposed to do. But I noticed he didn't do anything particular, except he commissioned me to write the Fourth Symphony.
You mentioned something earlier I thought was very interesting that I never heard before, but this business that, let me see, during the 20s and the 30s, then that he didn't play a great deal of American music, but it was more in the 40s.
Because he had his orchestra in Paris. He didn't get to Boston until 1924, I believe. And immediately, he began to show an interest in Copland and played Copland's First Symphony, which is the organ symphony rewritten for orchestra. And that because there they are together, because Nadia Boulanger, sitting up there in the picture with Koussevitzky, were great friends. And Copland had studied with Boulanger, and I had studied with Boulanger as well. So that was a thing that tied us together too, you see. So there was the Boulanger connection. They were friends from Paris. So in that way, Copland got played by Koussevitzky through Boulanger, and I got played through Boulanger and Copland, you see, by being introduced and written to by her. And so he was, his career in Paris was playing Prokofiev, premieres of Prokofiev, Stravinsky, lots, Martineau, very advanced. And then, of course, he had the famous Éditions Russes de Musique, his own publishing firm. Stravinsky's works were published, Prokofiev, all published by Koussevitzky. It was his wife's money, but it was put into that good use, you see. So, in a way, it was wonderful. And then think, when he was in Russia, he had invited Debussy to come. He has an orchestra that went up and down the Volga, and he invited Debussy to conduct that orchestra. He invited Scriabin to play as soloist with him. He published Scriabin's Prometheus, the poem of fire. So Koussevitzky was a tremendous figure in contemporary music, always because of his Paris reputation, and I'm sure that's why he was brought to Boston. But more than that, he was an extremely alluring man. He had everything. I mean, people still talk about the Koussevitzky back. He had suits fitted. I mean, no one looked one for a short man. He was shorter than I was, actually. I'm 5'7". I believe he was 5'6". But he was so beautifully proportioned and in wonderfully tailored clothes. He looked absolutely like a matinee idol, you know. And the women loved him, and he had great success in Boston. But the men in the orchestra made life miserable for him, because they would try to catch him and say, he doesn't know how to conduct. He doesn't know how to conduct irregular meters. And the story that Nicholas Slonimsky had to rebar the Sacra which to a certain degree is true. But he conducted, he got through it in Slonimsky's rebarring. But then Stravinsky had admitted that it was pretty difficult for him to conduct too, and he had invented those rhythms. So it wasn't true that Koussevitzky couldn't read. The story was he couldn't read. Well, how could the man compose? He made Bach transcriptions. He made other transcriptions. No, the man read very, very well. He did not have an easy technique facility at the keyboard, but he knew score reading very well, and he could read transposition. So that's a lot of nonsense about Koussevitzky not being illiterate, really.
Do you believe that story about that Slonimsky tells that Glier actually wrote the double bass concerto?
For him?
Yes.
I never heard that story. I don't remember reading it in his new book that came out. Slonimsky, there's a new book that Slonimsky wrote out, but he doesn't mention that. He writes about rehearsals with Koussevitzky, but the Glier, I don't know, maybe he did. I know he didn't play it.
Well, Slonimsky claims that Glier wrote Koussevitzky's double bass concerto.
Wrote his own concerto.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was supposedly written by Koussevitzky, but Slonimsky claims that Glier really was the author. Do you know anything about that?
I had never heard that story.
The only thing I could think is that, I guess they were pretty bad enemies there for a long time, and
Slonimsky and
Koussevitzky.
They weren't really enemies, because in his new book that's out, you will read, he doesn't give you that picture at all. Now, why would he write a book that came out just a few months ago and not say that? You see, nor does Moses Smith have that in his book, which is the first real biography of Koussevitzky that was written.
Well, I don't know. Olga told me that they were at each other's throats.
Well, they argued, but I wouldn't say that they were. It's just that they argued about musical things, you see. And the fact that I had heard that Koussevitzky wanted them there at morning, noon, and night at his beck and call, in order to play through the score while he conducted. You see, that he did work on the scores that way, which is very different from most other conductors. But a lot of conductors did do that in Europe. But Glier, having written Koussevitzky's double bass concerto, I doubt very much. That sounds to me like a fabrication in order to get back at Koussevitzky. First of all, I don't think it would be a risky thing to do, you know. I don't think Koussevitzky would have risked such a thing, getting out. Glier was very well known. Also, I don't hear any Glier in the Koussevitzky concerto. I mean, I know Glier's music, especially music of that period. It has nothing of Glier in it at all, as style.
Okay, well,
Also, I saw Koussevitzky's manuscript of the concerto. I saw the piano reduction, which was by another copyist. But Koussevitzky's orchestral score is in his own hand. It's not in Glier's handwriting.
Oh, you actually saw the original?
I saw the score, yes.
And it was in Koussevitzky's own handwriting?
It looked very much like his musical handwriting.
Well, I hadn't wanted to say it, but I guess it's all right then, because it occurred to me that maybe Slonimsky might be spreading this rumor just to get back at Dr. Koussevitzky. He would think that was the ultimate insult to...
Well, when was he doing this? Because I know Nicholas very well, and he never said a word to me about that. Now, he came to hear every one of my works in Boston. He would go back with me. He came to the Second Symphony. He came to the Sixth Symphony when Munch did it. Never in the years I've known Nicholas, and I saw him last year at the Juilliard School when we invited him to come to speak to the students. Never, and he would often stop by at the Hotel Iroquois where I was staying in the 60s. Never did he mention that, and we talked a great deal about Koussevitzky. Not once did that story of Glier having written the concerto.
I see, because a friend of mine about 4 years ago interviewed Slonimsky, and they were talking about Koussevitzky, and that's where this came from. Now, I'll have to check.
You have that on a tape?
Yes, and I have a transcript of the interview too. I'll have to double check.
I would be very interested to know if you have Nicholas's voice saying that. Then I could write him or call him up and say, Nicholas, what is this? All these years, maybe he let this out after Koussevitzky died, but I have never heard such a story since Koussevitzky's death.
I'll have to check my facts on that.
Would you?
Because right now I'm skating on a little bit of thin ice. I don't trust my memory for much of anything.
All right. I would be very interested because I can't imagine Koussevitzky with his enormous reputation by then. I mean, let alone the reputation he had in France and in Russia before. I mean, to have asked the composer of Glier's reputation to write a concerto and sign it with his own name, that doesn't sound to me like anybody would want to risk such a thing.
It sounded pretty far-fetched to me.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could go along and get your memories about Koussevitzky's baton technique. And now the reason I want to hear what you have to say about that is I never saw or heard Koussevitzky live. I first heard him when I was about 14 years old in 1957 on the 78s of the early LPs. And I never saw him until I saw the film, The Tanglewood Story, that they made in Tanglewood in 1949.
Yeah, that's a very good one. Gives you a good idea. But remember, that's already as he's an old man. I mean.
Well, yes, that Last Words of David, Randall Thompson, that's in the film, Randall Thompson work, and actually in that whole film there's only about 8 minutes of Koussevitzky conducting anyways, and that was just a few weeks really before his retirement, because it was in August of 49. And then there's another film from 1943. He's doing a little piece of Scheherazade in a rehearsal.
The Ravel Scheherazade or the Rimsky?
Rimsky. And certainly his baton technique, compared to the modern conductors who I see come through Fort Lauderdale in the wintertime, I would think is awfully hard to follow. I mean, the modern guys, most of them, they get it down, it would seem to me at least. I mean, I'm a non-musician, I can't even read music, but the baton technique of the new conductors, it seems to me, is so lucid. I mean, just as a neophyte, that I can kind of sit there and I can look at them, and it seems as though everything they do makes complete sense. And,
well, they're very, let's say, I would say, influenced by the neo Fritz Reiner and George Sell techniques, which was precision, small beats. Now, Koussevitzky conducted in small beats. There he was for a conductor who really based his own technique on Nickisch, because that when he was in Berlin and he bought up his small orchestra to begin training himself, his model was Nickisch, you see. And Nickisch's beat was a rather large beat, but evidently Koussevitzky had early on realized, I suppose, that a small beat would get you better results in amount of time and reaction from the orchestra, because it takes a certain amount of time, depending on the tempo you're beating in, to get the response from the player blowing or touching the string. You have to call what they call an anticipation beat. I mean, an upbeat, but Bernstein has these fabulous click beats. You see, if you go, bop, they're already breathing while this is doing that. So you'll get ta right on the nose when that finger comes down, or the wrist comes down, let's say. Now, Koussevitzky's was a small baton. He didn't like to use the big ones, you see. So he kept usually right here in the palm of his hand, and came up to about there, and was very precise, and he used only his left hand for expression, which is really why one should use. Conductors today who use the left hand for beating really are not good conductors at all. Now, I can understand, as Bernstein, as he's getting older and conductors develop rheumatism, arthritis, I can understand to rest this hand, you begin conducting with your left hand, then you go back, but you don't conduct this way with two hands, as I've seen some do. That's nonsense. This should be dynamics, louder, softer. This one keeps beating this. This you see, you more, less, cueing, while this is the beating. But Koussevitzky was wonderful. Now, how could a man who doesn't have a wonderful stick technique, how can he have the gall to start at Tanglewood and begin with four marvelous young talents who all had orchestras of their own, of which the most famous, of course, became Bernstein. Now, Bernstein, it's true, came from Reiner's class at the Curtis Institute, where the beat was so tiny, that men in the orchestra used to sort of, but this was Reiner's particular genius, in that he knew hand on the hip, and if they had to follow this tiny little beat, the louder the music got, the smaller and lower it got. The bigger you've never heard such a sound as he got by conducting this way, you see. So it's not true you have to do all that Bernstein does, but that's Bernstein's very romantic Koussevitzky-Stokowski thing. This is one of those.
The discussion of the stick technique.
And so Koussevitzky's technique was a rather wonderful one, because you can't teach and produce so many wonderful talents. Now, it's true that Bernstein did eventually take over most of the teaching assignments, you see. But it was Koussevitzky, and if you went to rehearsals, and everybody was, that was part of the enjoyment of going to Tanglewood in the early years, was to sit in the shed there and watch Koussevitzky rehearse, especially with the students, because you remember the war was on, so he had this very special orchestra of students, and it was marvelous to see him work with the students. And the man had a phenomenal way of getting through to a young conducting talent, very much as Bernstein does today. That's why he, I think, will end up doing what Koussevitzky did. And more he is with going across the country with young conductors. Now, I notice he's giving a concert in New York. He conducts the Shostakovich First Symphony, and then his three young apprentice conductors will conduct other works. He does that more and more now.
Of course, I guess it was quite a disappointment for Koussevitzky when the Boston Symphony management didn't want his young hand-chosen successors in Boston.
Oh, he was very, very disappointed, of course. But what can one do? It was like Rochester in those years too. Anybody who had a scandalous reputation of any kind, let alone Jewish, in Boston at that time. What is amazing was that Koussevitzky got the job. But of course he was a converted Jew, so that made it all right. But I assure you, the anti-Semitism in Boston was very, very bad. And between that and stories about Bernstein's personal life got around, and I remember even the discussions with Koussevitzky telling Lenny that, I think you should change your name to Burns, Leonard Burns. And Lenny just burst out. He just, absolutely guffawed in his face. I mean, ridiculous, you see. But, Rochester Bernstein couldn't get the job even here, and here he already had that fabulous success in 1943 with the New York Philharmonic. And yet he comes here as a guest conductor and wows everybody. The audience went crazy for him. They wanted him as the conductor. My sister was on the committee, Herbert Stern, one of the most important members of the board, but that son of a bitch named Arthur C., who was the manager of the orchestra. And Howard Hanson put in his 5 cents too, you see. So there was no chance of Lenny getting it here at all. But their story was that because he was a Jew, but I know otherwise.
I think it kind of broke Koussevitzky's heart that he wasn't able to continue to have that influence with the orchestra. The stories I've heard, he
guided Munch very beautifully into the job.
Think he did?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Oh, he helped him in the early days.
Well, he helped bring him. I mean, he got him the job.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Oh, yes. That was Koussevitzky's doing, to invite Munch, because there were so many others that the management was considering. But it was Koussevitzky's convincing statements at the meeting saying, but Munch is the one who follows best my particular style of conducting and technique. And he even described the man, and he invited him to come and guest conduct, and of course the ladies were taken with him at once.
So otherwise, after Bernstein and Di Cavallo, Munch...
Bernstein only conducted very few concerts, as a guest conductor. See, as I say, in Metropolis he had once, and then the success was too big. Lenny came several times, and that was fine. At Tanglewood too, and Cavallo, I never understood that was, but to me he was sort of a muscle bound. I mean, he was just, very tight. Indeed, the career didn't go anywhere. Walter Handel ended up very badly. He was here for a while as director of the school, and he became alcoholic. That was a great shock to me. And so he was thrown out of Eastman as the director. Now he conducts, I think, the Erie Philharmonic, and some say that he's on the wagon or that he's completely cured. But there again, and Thor Johnson, the other one, had Cincinnati, but it didn't go anywhere, and I believe he's dead. So you see, except for Bernstein, Richard Bales, who had the National Gallery Orchestra, he was also at Tanglewood. Bales had the gallery, but I doubt whether he would have gotten the National Symphony in Washington, because they felt he was too much an imitator of Koussevitzky's style and everything, you see. Well, so was Bernstein at the beginning very much. I still see Koussevitzky and Bernstein's conducting a great deal. The influence is still very apparent.
Just the few recordings that I have that Thor Johnson made, I've thought that Thor Johnson sounded the most like Koussevitzky of any of them.
He didn't have the temperament. He didn't have enough temperament, you see. Of all of them, the only one who had the temperament like Koussevitzky's was Bernstein.
I see.
Yeah. And there again, you see the Russian Jewish influence is very strong.
We have the rehearsal recording of Rounds, and...
Love to hear it.
Oh, it's just as soon as I get back to Florida, I'll put it right in the mail to you. I've got about a year and a half ago, I got a hold of a new copy of that, which was better than what I had before. So I got it in pretty reasonable sound now. I
went to Boston to hear the performance there. Then, of course, Koussi brought it for his All-American concert to New York. He did it with the Boston. He repeated the whole American. Sam Barber's cello concerto, William Schumann's American Festival Overture, my Rounds, and I forget, something of Copland, something of Hansen was on the program. Imagine doing that. Very few conductors gave all-American program in those years.
And of course, Rounds won a prize too.
It won the Music Critics Circle Prize, yeah.
But in the rehearsal, seems to me he plays it kind of fast. When the rehearsal starts out, the tempo sounds just perfect to me, and then he says, he stops and he says, "Now that's much too slow. Really, it's got to be twice as fast." And they take off lickety-split, and they almost do play it.
I think, I suspect, because I wasn't there for the rehearsal, I suspect that, you see, the first movement is in alla breve, it's in 2. And what I suspect is he may have wanted for the first reading to go through it in 4, which would have made a da 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 da. But if you take in 2, I can't even do it. Can't get my tongue going that fast. Is the way it must go. See, so what he probably was doing was in 4, and then decided that it would be better to take it twice as fast, which is what I have in the score, alla breve, in 2. You see, and you get into. So that sounds like what happened.
Oh, I see. I think it must be hard for the violins to play that.
Oh no, it's very easy. You see, being a
it is?
fiddler, it lies in the fingers. You see, this is what all strings. That's why probably it's lasted all these years, and why there's a new compact disc I heard put out by the Canadian Broadcasting, which is not as good as the Gerard Schwartz one. But I like the old Goldschmidt one. Too bad that Koussevitzky didn't record it for Victor, but Victor wouldn't do it.
I certainly, if you could go back and change history, I certainly would have rather had your second symphony recorded than Howard Hanson's third.
Well, here you join on to a whole legion of. I have letters that are now this high of that kind of tone. What in God's name was that piece of crap recorded for when your so-and-so should have been done? What the hell's went on in his mind? Why did he have to? There are many reasons why they had to do those pieces, and why my pieces did not get recorded. But Copland could say the same thing too. Remember, Copland, only when he began conducting and recording his own music, got his own pieces on. Other conductors did not. Koussevitzky didn't get the Short Symphony on records. Chavez did that. Koussevitzky actually did the Salon Mexico. No, it was the Adrian Bolt performance, and then Copland. No, I think I'm not the only one. And Roy Harris, after the Third Symphony, did not have everything of his recorded either. So that I think, to a certain degree, it is true. But I think Hansen and Harris were probably the greatest businessmen you see. Also, self-promoters. They would get on a train and go to New York. And Roy Harris lived practically with the Red Seal Victor Company, RCA people. That's how all his early music was recorded by them in exclusivity. Now, Howard Hansen got, as I told you, all of his stuff on Mercury Records. And they must have been fabulous engineers at that period, because the stuff still sounds marvelous. I have a recording of Mitchell Miller playing the Vaughan Williams oboe concerto on a Mercury recording, came out at the same time. Now, I play that Mitchell Miller performance of the Vaughan Williams. It sounds like the best of a compact disc sound. I can't imagine who that was at Mercury at that time, but Hansen must have known that it was somebody very expert, because all of his work sound very fine, and the other pieces he did too. But as I say, he got all of his stuff recorded. So there you are. But the other American composers, including myself, got short shrift, you see, and Piston had to wait patiently. I think at the time that Koussevitzky was playing Piston, he got a short piece for organ and strings recorded with E-Power Biggs, and then I don't think any of the symphonies ever made it with Koussevitzky. I think only with Munch did the Piston symphonies begin to be recorded.
Well, fortunately, there's a broadcast of Piston's Third Symphony, and we also have an unofficial recording of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. We might even find something else of yours in these Office of War information.
I would give anything to have that the third symphony that Munch did.
What was the date?
The third symphony was done in, I would say, 48, 49 maybe.
Before he was the conductor?
No, his first year. What would that be?
49, 50.
All right, that's it. That year.
Oh,
Or 50, probably 50.
Well, you see, WGBH radio didn't go on the air until October 1952, and so after that time, there were a lot of homemade recordings.
Oh, but it was on the air.
Your
The third symphony was on the air because I have it, but the tape that was made by David Oppenheim, he took it off the air. He lost the tape, so all I have is my terribly scratched acetates made from that tape, so I never could get a good copy of it made. You see.
If you could let me know the exact date the broadcast was, I can see what I can do to dig up a copy of it.
Sure.
I think we probably could.
And also the Sixth Symphony, which Munch did too in '56.
Yeah, well, just get me a date, because
right.
I think if we've been successful digging up so many Koussevitzky things as we have from long ago, that and anything like as recent as 1950, there wouldn't be any problem.
By association, sure. After a literal translation, Ronde de Printemps, rounds of spring. Exactly. Sure, he probably knew the Debussy. He thought he would refer to mine as vernal and spring-like.
So you don't think he took an awful lot of liberties with the works that you wrote that he played?
No, definitely not. I would say Munch was a little bit more erratic than Koussevitzky was. Munch, I really had to sort of beg him to stick to the tempo or to do things this way. Never did I have to say anything to Koussevitzky. He would say to me, "No, how was?" I said, "Marvelous." I mean, I was absolutely knocked out by it, especially what he did in the slow movement of the Second Symphony. I thought it was so beautiful. Now there he could have, exaggerated enormously and stretched out tempi the way he did in Sibelius and Tchaikovsky, but he did not do it in my symphony, so he must have had that good sense to know that that was not the right thing to do with my style of music. You see, I had a feeling he conducted my symphony as he would have done it a Bruckner symphony, and he had conducted Bruckner. So I think that's something that may have made him felt secure. He was a very good Bruckner conductor. I wish he had done more Bruckner.
There was another thing you mentioned I thought was kind of interesting, that he stayed away from these works unless he could get a first performance.
Yes. He had this terrible thing about first performances, and was rather envious if anybody gave their works to somebody else. He didn't like the idea of doing it after somebody else had done it.
That was quite a limitation, wasn't it?
Yes, I think that's also one reason that he commissioned works, that the Koussevitzky Foundation for Commissioning Works got into being. Maybe we have to thank him for that trait in his character, because by commissioning works he would have first performances, you see. Of course, now it goes on after his death, it goes on by itself. But during his lifetime, I'm sure he knew, just as in Russia, he knew that with the Édition Russe de Musique, he was doing something for the Russian composer.
You were or are a board member of the Koussevitzky Music Foundation, weren't
No.
you? No. I seem to remember seeing your name on that letterhead years ago.
Well, I was what they call an honorary board member. There were lists of people who sponsored it in those years,
Oh, I see.
and my name was on that. But I was never a member of the board, actually, that making decisions. No, I could recommend composers for commissions as I do now whenever they write, but in those years there were. Usually the composers that he had played, like Sam Barber, myself, Roy Harris, Copeland, Bernstein.
Does the foundation do much of anything nowadays?
Oh yes, they commission annually. They commission chamber music. Almost more, I would say, chamber music than orchestral now.
Now, who's the head of the foundation now?
I can't be sure. There is a board. I know that Jacob Druckmann was on that committee for a number of years and may still be on it. I don't know who the other members are. It's a long time. As I get older, I find I've got to just break with serving on those committees because it's just too time absorbing. I've got too much work to finish up and it just takes too much time.
I know that Maria Di Pasquale complained to me a couple of years ago. She didn't think the foundation was very active.
Oh, no.
But I didn't know exactly what she meant.
Every year there are new commissions from the Koussevitzky Foundation. I don't think it's getting the attention that it used to get, you see, because the works that are commissioned are, which would never have happened in Koussevitzky's time, these commissions are given to young composers who are in residence in universities all over the country. So we naturally don't hear about them because it's some small university out in Kansas or something. And you sometimes will get a broadcast from some university and you'll hear commissioned by the Koussevitzky Foundation in the Library of Congress, you see. But in Koussevitzky's time, when a work was commissioned, like the Bartók or My Fourth Symphony or any of the other symphonic ode of Copland, these, I mean, this got enormous amount of attention in the press, you see.
Is Berezovsky still alive?
No, he died in the 50s.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
I heard his third symphony conducted by Koussevitzky in the Library of Congress a few weeks ago. Oh, it's in high fidelity.
Yeah.
Magnificent recording.
Oh, sure. It's a great tragedy that nobody plays Berezovsky's music. It's just heartbreaking. I mean, I just don't know anymore what to do. I have taught, you see, I've taught for many years at Juilliard, and in my seminars I've had some of these young conductors like James Conlon and Andrew Litton, and oh yes, Mr. Diamond in class, oh, and if anything happens and I become well known and I should get an orchestra mine, oh, I'm going to conduct these works that you recommend, oh, absolutely. They'd write these into their notes, you know, at the end. And then I run into them now and I say, well, you have the Washington Symphony, you have Rotterdam Symphony, you have this, you have that. Why don't you ever play any contemporary music? You don't play a work of mine, you don't play a work of Copland's, you just play the old standard repertoire. What is it? Well, it's a bad time for modern music, is the way James Conlon puts it.
Well, I guess they're just trying to please the audiences, huh?
Oh, I think it's the managers. It's the same old story. The managers, and you have to please the managers because they're the ones who get you the engagements. You see, they work out the deals.
I don't know. I don't pretend to be very sophisticated about my tastes in music. I mean, I just like big old broad melodies. I love melodies. And
well, broad melodies are in my music, but does that get? The conductors are not playing it. You see, they're not playing me, or are they playing? If they choose a contemporary work, they choose the work that is going to cause the worst reaction in the audience. You see.
Not too many composers, especially nowadays, write down melodies.
There are no melodists today.
Now, your second symphony is just full of wonderful melodies.
Because I come from that generation when melody was the reason for being. You see, the music that is written by the young composers today is what I call a language of syllables. It would be equivalent to a person who does not complete all the syllables in a word. You see, if I say you don't know that I'm saying, I'm afraid we'll have to stop soon because it will be late. You see, I gave you only half of each syllable of each word. That's what they write in what's called a 12-note technique, or they use synthesizers, computers. Even in popular, they steal like crazy. Now, for example, have you listened to the cues on the NBC News in the morning that the conductor of the Boston Pops wrote?
The cues?
Yeah, the ones that open the NBC News in the morning.
No.
Well, it's the opening of my rounds.
Well, see, I never listened to the television. Maybe I listened to...
Well, Just out of curiosity, you know the rounds.
Oh,
Turn it
sure.
on. Well, ASCAP asked me if they wanted me to sue him. I ran into him at a party and I said, I'm David Diamond. He said, oh my God, I heard. I said, you didn't hear anything from my lips, but I am sort of amazed because I'm curious as to how you can just lift a little, and against that he's got the same kind of tune almost going. He said, I know many people have mentioned it, but I assure you I admire the rounds. I've loved that piece. I said, well, the love must have come out, but don't you know that if a thing gets too close to home, you don't let it get through? You don't put it down? What would I do if I loved Debussy so much? Am I going to do it? I said, you do what a lot of Hollywood composers. Now, when I worked in Hollywood, one day I'll never forget, I was over at a man named George Dooning's home, and I had gone to the bathroom, which was on the second floor, and I passed a room, and I saw lots of pocket scores, lined up with pieces of paper sticking out. And he was a composer at Columbia Pictures, where I was doing the music for Anna Lucasta. And that's how we met. And when I came down, I said, George, and I did go in, I went through and I looked. Every Copeland, he's got strips of paper stuck to it. Diamond, he's got strips of paper. All of our scores lined up with pieces of paper. They lift 4 notes out and they turn them backwards, you see. Now today this is done, they feed it into a computer. For example, you can take the opening of any theme and feed it to a computer. Instead of the notes being, let's say, Chekhov, dee-dee-dum, dee-da-da-da, dee-da-dum, they take it backwards and feed it into the composer. Out comes da-dee-da-da-da, dee-da-dum, so they have a new tune.
Most of it doesn't sound very well.
It sounds nondescript. It's faceless music, but it fits whatever the images are on the TV program.
Well, we've got just about 5 minutes left on the tape here. I got just one last question here, and I suppose only a non-musician like myself would come up with a question like this. But how do you think up these melodies? I mean, like I used to hear about Rachmaninoff would go for a walk in the sunset, and somehow that would inspire him to write these wonderful melodies, or he became hypnotized.
I dare say that he probably was inspired by nature. He came from that generation where walking in the woods in Russia or wherever might be. I don't have to do that. The years that I worked at the MacDowell Colony or Yaddo, I walked a lot in those among the pines, but I never got any ideas. I'm afraid I'm more like Stravinsky or Debussy. It's when I'm in front of the piano and working at the piano that I will get ideas. Rarely will I. Well, now and then when I'm walking in the street, I might get an idea. Something might come. But I can't say that no one really has been able to explain where the great composers, or those of us who still write music with real melodies, and I teach my students at Juilliard how to write melodies, because I get a generation of composers who never were taught melodic writing. They begin with 12 notes, what I call pushing the 12 notes around. See, they start with the dodecaphonic technique, and anybody can write that if you know how to notate. But to inspire, to come out, really what that word means, to have this air come out of you full of a long melodic line that means something to somebody, so that your attention, something reacts to you as a human being. If you say that to a student, they say, oh, but isn't that rather old-fashioned, Mr. Diamond? I said, stop worrying about old-fashioned, because there is no such thing. A fine melody, a good melody, is going to be always in fashion. See, the trouble with the younger people today is everything is a trend. This was never so in my time or the generations before. Today, kids are conformists. They have to be. Remember when they were all boys with hair down their back? If I had 2 inches longer at high school in 1930, 2 inches longer, hey, fruitcake, hey, queer. 1960s, I couldn't tell a boy from a girl. Some of the guys with the handsome faces, with the long hair, I thought they were women. You see, but nobody called them fruitcakes. So that shows what has happened. Today, boys are going around with ear. Then you remember when suddenly the boys are wearing bracelets? Unbelievable. These are all straight guys, you see. So What is this all about? Trends, you see. Now, does that, I mean, I ask kids today, what are you wearing this for? You're supposed to be gay if you wear it. No, it's this one if you're gay. No, it's this one if it's gay. You know, I said, well, what do you want to wear it anyway? You know, it's ridiculous. It looks sort of silly. He said, maybe to you, but I like it.
Well, do you think that you can teach a student how to write a melody?
Oh, yes, certainly. You use models. You show them how Mendelssohn or Beethoven constructed. See, Beethoven was the perfect one to use because he really began a melody with what's called a motive, 3 notes. And then what he would do with those 3 notes to finally end up with a fine tune. Da da dee dee da da dee dee da 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 dee da da dee dee da da dee dee and da da dee. And they say Beethoven couldn't write melodies, but he began with da da dee. Da da dee da. You'd find sketchbooks loaded with these, and you could see him struggling to get these all worked out in some way, and out comes this way. So he really worked in constructing it. We have his sketchbooks, and that's what I use with my students to show how. I don't teach them how to write academic pedantic melodies, such as were found in books of the latter part of the 19th century, codified melodic construction books, such as you got in the German conservatories. But I do teach them the arch, how a melody usually grows from a low to a high peak and comes down, or it begins at a high point, comes down. If it does start high, you have double trouble. You have to learn how to bring it down and how to make it end in a certain special way. But by the time my kids are through, and by now I have a reputation as a teacher as the only one who's been producing students who really write melodies. And they're winning prizes all over the place.
Well, my friend in Syracuse last night played me your Romeo and Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to these beautiful themes. And so I thought when I got over here this afternoon, I just asked you that.
I just came back from hearing Christopher Keane do it with the Long Island Symphony. I tell you, to walk out during intermission, have people come up to you and say, Mr. Diamond, I tell you, I was so moved. I find this work so beautiful. Where can I get a recording? I said, well, luckily it is available on cassette, so you can get it. But to have people come to you and say, oh, this music is beautiful. Why hadn't I heard it? Why doesn't our orchestra play it? You know.
It's almost like a lost art to write.
It was played a great deal in the 40s and the 50s, you see, when it first came out. But because of the new young conductors that come in, they don't play that music, you see. That's why things don't go into repertoire. But a Koussevitzky, a Stokowski, a Metropolis, they played our music. Today, these little SOBs, these squirts, you know, who are making millions, they would think that Michael Tilson Thomas, another little jerk of the first water.
I wouldn't give you 5
talented jerk, but that's about it. Mickey Mouse, we call him. But I mean, this is the trouble. He's got big orchestra conductor. Doesn't do my music, doesn't it? I mean, he does who is good for what the recording people tell him to do, and that thing. He's a businessman.
So otherwise, these melodies, you don't just get them by osmosis somehow. It's you work.
It's an unconscious process. Nobody's been able to explain where melodies come from. You can explain all the other arts, but nobody has been able to explain where melody, the ability to write melody, Tchaikovsky's, Brahms, Beethoven's, mine, Copland's. Nobody can tell you what part of the brain even. They haven't got it down. No computer has turned up any clue to how this happens. The only thing you can do is feed the computer a series of pitches and rhythms, and out will come a fabricated tune. But it's not going to send anybody into swoons, you know.
Well,
I can write a lot of those melodies. Oh, you know, I could have made a fortune writing jingles, for example. People said, you need the money. Go up to see so-and-so. You can turn